So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 6th conference celebrating the James Sowell Family Collection in Literature, Community, and the Natural World. I'm Bella Gerlich, and I'm the Dean of the University Libraries. The libraries in the Southwest Collection Special Collections Library are very proud to host this conference for students and scholars from Texas Tech and across the country, and we are grateful that you are here to share this experience with us. Joining us this year, we are excited to have esteemed collection supporters. Barry Lopez, whose archive forms a cornerstone for the collection and who serves as a mentor to TTU students and as ambassador for the collection. And Stephen Small, who donated a significant collection of books and ephemera about the history of the conservation movement in the United States. Among our speakers, we are also honored to showcase Dr. Stephen Graham Jones and Dr. Tony Jensen, both who have strong ties to the university as former students and faculty. We will also hear the work of such talented and distinguished poets as Barbara Rass and Derek Sheffield. This year's conference, supported by our co-sponsors, the Texas Tech Office of the Provost, the Honors College, and the Department of English, is sure to be engaging with topics and themes running from architecture on the Llano Estacado and poems inspired by veterinary science, as well as sessions on pedagogy and eco-criticism, and many more. Before I close, please help me to give a special thanks to Dr. Diane Warner, librarian for the Sowell Family Collection, for her coordination of the conference. Diane? In case you'd like to share conference sessions and relive them again, we'll be filming them and hosting them via ThinkTech, our online publishing and archival service. Watch for Facebook and Twitter channels. Search for Texas Tech University Libraries for more information. Again, thank you all for participating, and we hope you enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to also thank all of you for coming for our 6th Sowell Collection Conference. And just as a little matter of housekeeping, before we get started, I'd like to remind you to turn off your cell phones so that we don't have little ringy-dings when we're having interesting discussions. And also, before I introduce Christian Knoeller, I just want to tell you a little bit about our relationship with him and how it came about in as I understand it, and he might correct me, that many of you know Professor Kurt Caswell in the Honors College, and he attends the ASLE conference when it's held, and last time it was in Moscow, Idaho, and he promotes the Sowell collection in the conference while he's there, and so I believe that, Christian came by the table and talked to Kurt, and so Kurt was able to inform and enlighten him about what we had here. But then Christian also knew Lou Martinelli, who's the literary executor for the Paul Gruchow papers. And so with this wonderful meeting of two very smart, caring people, we are now the curator for the Paul Gruchow papers. But it took about 2 years to get it all happening. And we are processing the collection now, so it should be ready for researchers in the next month. But that's a little background of how we came to have Christian Knoeller here, also talking to us about the Paul Gruchow. So now I'll read his bio after I told that little story. Christian Knoeller serves as Associate Professor in English at Purdue University and is past President of Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature. He has published book chapters and articles widely on both critical and pedagogical topics, including internationally in Canada and Australia. In recent years, his scholarship on environmental history, as well as Midwestern and Native American literature, has appeared in leading eco-critical journals such as Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment from the Association for Literature and Environment, published by Oxford University Press, as well as the Journal of Eco-Criticism in Canada. This wide-ranging work is consolidated in the book manuscript Reimagining Environmental History, Ecological Memory in the Wake of Landscape Change, which is forthcoming from the University of Nevada Press in October 2017. In addition, Professor Knoeller was awarded the Gwendolyn Brooks Prize for Poetry, as well as Jill Barnum Midwestern Heritage Prize for Literary Criticism from the Society for the Study of Midwestern Literature, and his collection of poems, Completing the Circle, won the Millennium Prize. So please join me in welcoming Christian Knoeller.
Before I begin, I'd like to say some thanks and make some acknowledgments. First of all, to Diane and people associated with the Sowell Family Collection for hosting this event. I do have to mention it is my 15th wedding anniversary today, so in truth, the real thanks goes to my wife, Julie, who allowed me to come with very little protest. Diane mentioned Lou Martinelli. He's become a dear friend. Lou was very close to Paul, so much so that Paul entrusted him with his papers, and he serves as literary executor. Lou did me the honor of opening that archive before it was acquired by Texas Tech as the first scholar to have a look at it and the opportunity to quote from the unpublished material, which, let me tell you, is extensive and exciting. Lou would be here himself in many respects. I'm here on his behalf because he's today, in fact, traveling to Minnesota where he has several speaking engagements this week. I'd like to acknowledge the press, the University of Nevada Press, and especially the director, Justin Race, for giving me permission to share this copyrighted yet unpublished material with you today and subsequently online. A very generous gesture. I can't help but acknowledge the presence of Barry Lopez, elder statesman among contemporary literary naturalists, acknowledge his monumental contribution to American letters and the profound influence his writing has had on my thinking and writing, well, since Of Wolves and Men appeared in the late 1970s. Thank you for being here. Finally, and this will sound gratuitous, but trust me, I can date my acquaintance with the writings of Henry David Thoreau with precision to June of 1971. It was the summer after my junior year in high school. My mother evidently was concerned that I would fritter away the entire recess doing things like fishing and bicycling, which I probably actually did. So she asked me what I was planning to read, and then quickly added, if you want something truly significant, you might want to pick up Walden. Well, I'm still reading and writing about Thoreau all these years later. And the reason I mention this is my mother, bless her heart, passed away at 92 years of age a week ago today. So it is that this talk is in her memory. It's titled Islands of Time. Paul Gruchow's contribution as a literary naturalist lies at the cusp of ecology and memory, nature and culture. While the influence of Henry David Thoreau is pervasive, his reverence toward the natural world and sheer lyricism can be likened to John Muir's. He was also inspired by 20th century essayists such as Lorne Isley, Rachel Carson, and E.O. Wilson, who he credits with having bridged the humanities and sciences by synthesizing diverse disciplines. Believing that the finest essays of this kind are inevitably personal and reflective, he most admired those writers informed by the scientific literature who nonetheless democratized the genre by addressing a wide general audience, much as he himself sought to do. His work also follows in the tradition of American writing that explores natural history in relation to several dimensions of time, whether diurnal, seasonal, geological, or evolutionary. His convictions as a conservationist were ultimately grounded in an appreciation for ecological memory, encompassing deep time as well as recent environmental history. By the end of his career, in fact, he had begun to articulate a more nuanced and intricate appreciation than had been advanced by previous generations of pioneering ecologists for the complex interdependencies in the succession through the coevolution of species. Above all, he believed that we must begin to stem the tide of extinction for moral as well as ecological reasons. Thoreau was clearly a touchstone for Gruchow, who in his journals reflected on the depth of their connection and expressed a profound affinity on several levels. First, there were similarities to their temperaments as fellow wanderers, equally prone to solitude and introspection. Moreover, both deplored conformity and were fiercely independent. Above all, he sensed a spiritual kinship. We believe against the fashion, Gruchow declared in his journals, in the divine content of nature, in the importance of being attached irrevocably to place, in the ultimate authority of truth to oneself. Acknowledging parallels to English and German Romanticism, he shared Thoreau's penchant for contemplating philosophical and spiritual questions grounded in close observation of the natural world. Gruchow's conception of wilderness was complex and vexing, one that anticipated debates about the place of human stewardship and management that rage to the present day. Viewing Isle Royal, for example, in Lake Superior, offshore of Copper Harbor at the northeastern extreme of the Keenewaw Peninsula in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, he considered the role that ecologists play in maintaining the native species there, particularly populations of moose and wolves. The process of determining appropriate conservation measures on the island had been complicated by the arrival of wolves migrating across lake ice in winter, dwindling genetic diversity of such a small, isolated population, and severe overgrazing whenever the moose population spikes. Gruchow distilled the ecological and ethical issues at stake into three questions. Are our wilderness preserves museums, or are they laboratories? How should they be managed, and to what end? Where should the line be drawn between benign neglect and the failure of stewardship? Just when and how, he wondered, should we attempt to steer natural systems towards some idealized or pre-existing state? Moreover, what purposes are to be served by protecting significant tracts of land where ecological integrity remains largely intact? He acknowledged the conventional aim of preserving biological resources that might give rise to utilitarian ends, such as a repository of botanical sources for formulating medicines. He deemed such rationales self-evident. In the long run, species diversity might also provide an ecological safety net. A library of genetic information to develop new crops or to fortify existing ones. Moreover, he already sensed, as has become increasingly evident in the decades since, that the ecological consequences of human alterations to the planet now approach the absolute. Preservation of the biosphere in all its present richness and diversity is not merely expedient, he declared at a meeting of environmentalists in 1988, but essential to the very survival of life itself. Gruchow understood that the conventional thinking of ecologists and wildlife biologists at the middle of the 20th century, had begun a subtle but fundamental shift away from models based on succession toward a presumably static climax community. The new thinking, which he fully embraced, posited ecological change as a constant process. Above all, he grasped that preservation was being redefined in bold new ways. Beyond addressing the workings of biological processes per se, he believed that natural history must attend to its significance in human life, a more inclusive view, one that complements ecological knowledge with the emotional, ethical, and spiritual dimensions of our relationship to the rest of life on Earth. Indeed, he believed that that natural history inevitably includes a sense of oneself in relation to what is observed. Such synthesis matters, he realized, because we share with it a common past, and because once we become aware of that commonality, we know in a deeper and truer way who we are. Like his predecessors among Midwestern naturalists, Gruchow studied the landscape for evidence of change and recognized the cumulative impact of the ongoing expansion of cropland. He understood how the erasure of the grasslands and wetland ecosystems of the upper Midwest had profound environmental consequences. As we have drained the marshes, leveled the forests, farmed the prairies, and diverted the waters of the western rivers for the greening of the deserts, we have done something more pervasive than simply destroying a multitude of local habitats. We undermined the framework for biological diversity. There are only a few places left in the United States where you can see the prairies as they looked even 100 years ago. The lessons that the prairies might teach us, he lamented, are almost lost. In Worlds Within a World, Gruchow's depiction of the Ripley-Esker Reserve, one of a dozen of Minnesota's designated scientific and natural areas, suggests several centuries of landscape change still unfolding. I saw the Bur Oak savanna, a prairie landscape, and beyond it, an old field reverting to savanna with the use of controlled burns to favor native species. This capsule narrative of environmental history encompasses three distinct phases: native grasslands altered by settlement and cultivation, reverting again to a feral state once farmsteads had been abandoned, followed by subsequent management and regeneration. This progression parallels patterns of environmental history that played out in other regions, such as New England, as chronicled by William Cronin, Kent Ryden, and Tom Wessels. As Scott Russell Sanders concludes, by the mid-20th century, when Paul Gruchow was growing up in southwestern Minnesota, the tallgrass prairie had become little more than a memory. All but a few remnants of these millions of acres had been plowed. Vast herds and flocks had dwindled or entirely disappeared. Nonetheless, the natural forces that had created the tallgrass prairie were still in play. Like other naturalists in the Midwest, including Aldo Leopold and Paul Arrington, he advocated preserving representative examples of a variety of naturally occurring ecosystems for posterity. He contemplated the fate of remaining fragments of wetlands on the grasslands and understood that by functioning as refugia, such wilderness preserves comprise biological islands in time. A generation earlier, the region had become a veritable crucible for early ecological thought in the wake of pervasive agricultural practices that had profoundly altered the tallgrass prairie. Raised on a small farm in the upper Midwest, Gruchow grew up on the front line of upheaval, sweeping the region as agribusiness displaced millions of families, including his own, 20th century farmers who continued to tend a variety of traditional crops and livestock on relatively modest plots, a model of self-sufficiency rooted in Jeffersonian tradition. In fact, his grandparents, who farmed as homesteaders, knew the region's hardships well, having buried their first 8 children there. As a child, he witnessed the predicament faced by small farmers with the advent of modern large-scale farming methods, at a time when the social and environmental consequences of this new agriculture were only beginning to be understood. He was born the very first year of the first miracle chemical of the industrial agriculture was introduced in 1947, a moment when the rhetoric of progress and efficiency were widely marshaled to justify a fundamental reorientation of American agricultural practices. That industrial model, he argued, has since largely eclipsed the deep and meaningful appreciation of nature gained by direct personal engagement entailed in tilling and harvest. He lamented both the human and ecological costs. In the decade of my coming of age, millions of farm dwellers left the land. If you grew up on a farm in the last 50 years, as I did, you would have noticed the diminishing songbirds, the disappearing butterflies, the vanishing potholes, the uprooted fence rows, the balding hilltops. Returning years later to the site of his family's farm in Rosewood Township, he reported a host of small mammals and migratory songbirds were no longer to be found. Even the marsh was gone, with alarming consequences for the very wildlife that had inspired his interest in natural history. The waterfowl are gone. The raptors are gone. The burrowing animals are gone. The predators and herbivores are gone. And once gone, he realized, such thriving wild communities are all too soon forgotten. The heritage has so thoroughly vanished, in fact, that it no longer survives, even in memory, he wrote. With the antelope, elk, and bison gone, what remained, he concluded, was indeed a pale ghost of the world that once existed in this place. His accounts of lost abundance resemble those of Arrington, who had chronicled similar declines in wildlife populations in Iowa and the Dakotas a generation earlier. Indeed, the narratives of environmental history by the region's pioneering ecologists provide a repository of cultural memory, chronicling landscape change, as well as reflecting our shifting relationship to nature over time. Gruchow viewed such trends as both ecologically brittle and socially destabilizing, causing the impoverishment that befell every aspect of rural culture with the industrialization of farming, and proclaimed agribusiness the death of the culture of agriculture. We have, over the past half century, he concluded, driven all but a handful of our farmers from the land, at an enormous cost to soil, water, fuel, and biological diversity. He recognized that agricultural practices predicated on increasing dependence on petrochemicals and mechanization were clearly unsustainable environmentally. The cumulative impact has been monumental ecologically, especially on the diversity of native species. Well aware of the extent of what had already been lost, he championed the preservation of native ecosystems that remained and advocated that rural students become acquainted with the ecological and geological history of the place. Paul Gruchow contends that knowing one's place also engenders a sense of belonging and responsibility, because it enables a person to understand one's dependence on the natural landscape and on other members of shared communities. As people have fewer opportunities to directly observe nature, they know less and less about the natural and cultural history of the places they live. In his journals, He lamented that traditional bonds to place stretching back across so many generations had been largely severed in transitory modern societies. As a boy, Gruchow had been enraptured by unsettled places he perceived to be wild, and even fancied becoming a backcountry trapper for a time, much as Arrington had done, romanticizing the rugged, primitive lifestyles glorified by adventure and sporting literature. To hunt or trap successfully, he discovered, necessitates acquiring an intimate acquaintance with animal behavior, as well as learning to read the ecological intricacies of a landscape. Moreover, such early experiences afield can inculcate a heightened empathy and lifelong appreciation for wildlife, and, as others from Thoreau to Arrington have observed, engender a sense of environmental ethics. Ultimately, he believed, what had begun as a youthful lust for hunting could mature, as it had for him, into reverence as well as a sense of responsibility. The place that initially captivated him was actually a bog, his first glimpse of the ancient wetland ecosystems of the tallgrass prairie, verdant and teeming with life. He intuitively grasped that even smaller pothole lakes were well springs of species biodiversity. He relished their antiquity, having existed for thousands of years, a surviving testament to the tallgrass prairie, with its miles of roots and unseen rivers underground. Ecosystems centered on surface water supported as rich a diversity of life as anywhere on the prairies. Frogs, snakes, and insects numbering in the thousands of species. And so came the skunks and weasels, the minks and foxes, the raccoons, the mice and shrews, and on the uplands, the burrowing animals, the ground squirrels and badgers, the pocket gophers. And in pursuit of them came the wolves and coyotes, the raptors, the hawks and owls. And in the tall grasses around them grazed the great herbivores, the bison, elk, and antelope. And the water lasted from year to year, attracting muskrats and turtles, clams and crayfish. This litany of species, once native to Minnesota, is reminiscent of Arrington's accounts of abundance a generation earlier in the Dakotas, at the time of settlement, when extensive wetlands brimming with biodiversity still provided habitat for such a wide variety of native wildlife to thrive. Gruchow recounted how the prairie biome had historically been anchored by nearly 100 varieties of grass, each species a marvel unto itself. The big blue stem, taller than a man, and in September the color of a fine wine. The needle-sharp grasses with their twisted seed pods, sharp as pins, that wind themselves into the earth like corkscrews. The bearded plumes of the Canada wild rye. The feathery spires of the Indian grass. The little tufts of the blue grama grass with flowers. To his eyes, the profusion of hundreds upon hundreds of types of wildflowers elevated the grasslands to a veritable garden, from the first flocks of spring to the profusion of plants blooming in autumn. Bird species were particularly numerous, including over 100 kinds of songbirds, as well as raptors, owls, and millions upon millions of migratory waterfowl. Moreover, countless pothole lakes were once populated by multitudes of amphibians, particularly frogs, as well as reptiles such as turtles and snakes. In the long run, he reckoned, ecological complexity ensured vitality. Prairies comprised of an enduring mosaic of thousands of separate species that had co-evolved over millennia. Indeed, like Leopold, he saw such biodiversity as evidence of ecological integrity and a measure of its resilience, One of the principles upon which the prairies were made, he wrote, was the principle of diversity. It is an alliance of differences that the prairie finds its vigor. It fashions its resilience and stability. By contrast, monocultural cultivation, he realized, is ultimately unsustainable, even precarious, due to its dependence on a handful of plants. During the 20th century, he reasoned, coming to rely increasingly on a single crop such as corn as the basis for so many processed foods was to court disaster, since it would take, his words, exactly one persistent pathogen to devastate our culture as we know it, not unlike the Plains Indian cultures undermined by the precipitous decline of the bison. Who could have imagined how vulnerable the once seemingly inexhaustible herds would become, or how suddenly they would nearly disappear? Gruchow lamented how the species had long since been eradicated across much of the continent. It's been a century since buffalo wandered freely in that country, but their ghosts linger in the grass, as well as in our memory and imagination. Observing a remnant herd preserved at Minnesota's Blue Mountains, grazing the pasture in a fenced enclosure, he was again reminded of the region's environmental legacy in deep time. These survivors, he declared, are the ghosts of the lost world of the prairie. Gruchow's first book offers a comprehensive account of the cultural significance of the buffalo to those Native Americans for whom they were the very staff of life, exhaustively cataloging the uses for its hides and horns, sinew and hooves, organs and bones. Indispensable, their continued abundance had long been a cultural article of faith. Gruchow sympathized with the plight of the Plains Indian, deprived of game that had sustained an entire way of life, particularly following the introduction by Europeans of horses in the Americas. For once the great herds had been extirpated, such traditional lifeways would suddenly become untenable. As the buffalo died, he recounted, so died whole nations and cultures on the Great Plains. Yet what fascinated Gruchow most was the complex role of this formidable animal in Plains Indian life. Besides providing sustenance and the makings of material culture, it had taken on great symbolic and mythological significance as well. In his journals, Gruchow began to conceptualize plans for an ambitious book about the American bison, one he would not live to complete, spanning the centuries from the first European contact to the tragedy at Wounded Knee. He hoped that such a study could ultimately encompass indigenous cosmologies predicated on spiritual dimensions of sacred relationship to nature. Native Americans reliant on the bison, he recognized, forged one of the closest relationships between human beings and a single animal the world has ever known, one encompassing religion. The ghost dance, as a whole, was predicated on the reappearance of the vanquished herds from the underworld. Sundance ceremonies similarly sought to ensure their enduring strength and return year after year. Such rituals constituted an expression of reverence and gratitude that maintained a sacred balance between people and the creatures upon which their own survival ultimately depended. Yet, such heavy dependence on a single species, he acknowledged, left Plains tribes vulnerable to its demise. Like other literary naturalists before him and since, Gruchow contemplated the complex cultural legacy of the Americas. He challenged conventional stereotypes that posited Indian identity in essentialized ways, and acknowledging instead the linguistic and cultural diversity among hundreds of tribes across the continent. He grasped how their subsistence practices were inevitably tethered to seasonal cycles and consequently connected to specific places, as well as the potential for religious expression of such a relationship. These reflections were often occasioned by traveling to places where Native Americans had left major traces on the landscape itself, like Scott Russell Sanders and Elizabeth Dodd, who have pondered the Ojibwe pictographs painted on islands in Minnesota's boundary waters. Gruchow sensed how such ancient art can stir our imaginations today in powerful ways. Many compelling questions remain unanswered. Why were they made? Or why were they made where they were made? Or what in general do they signify? Or to whom are they addressed? Pondering the meaning of ancient art and its potential purpose as prayer, Gruchow approached such sacred sites with humility. He realized that interpreting today what they had once been meant to represent, let alone why they were made, remains subject to conjecture. He acknowledged the difficulty of interpreting the significance of the glyphs fully, since cultural memory had been disrupted, including the narratives of their creation, meaning, and function that have been forgotten. Since the symbolism of geometric figures such as spirals and concentric circles continues to elude us, the mystery itself evokes wonder while tantalizing the imagination. Indigenous peoples, he concluded, came to know a place spiritually. This is what it means to be native to a place. To know it intimately enough so that one can say, where lives its spirit or spirits? Ultimately, he confided, I hope that they might tell me something about what it means to be indigenous. Visiting Medicine Wheel Monument in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, Gruchow contemplated another historic trace left by Native Americans on the landscape. Medicine Wheel struck him as hallowed ground, with its panoramic vistas providing a visceral sense of grandeur. We do not know how the monument came into being, he concluded, or why. These mysteries still beckon us, often evoking a sense of reverence. After its makers moved on, the narratives that once animated this sacred place fell silent. Consequently, modern interpretations by definition remain provisional. Since we are reading the indigenous text of this landscape, but lacking the cultural memory that originally brought it into being. In a similar way, reading natural landscapes for implicit narratives of environmental, as opposed to cultural history, also entails imagining what came before. Gruchow recounted a succession of ecosystems in the wake of glaciation, for example. As tundra studded with spruce were followed by bur oak savanna, and finally the grasslands, whose extent bewildered the first Europeans to explore them. By the time of the European exploration, the vast majority of Native American peoples across the continent were also actively engaged in agriculture, cultivating corn. Consequently, subsistence skills inculcated from one generation to generation included a place-specific mix of hunting and gathering practices, as well as cultivating crops such as beans, melons, squash, sunflowers, and tobacco. The sustainability of such pre-contact agriculture, Gruchow reasoned, was not due to ecological reckoning, but rather mobility. Once attractive arable land was worn out and lost its fertility, villages were simply moved and new fields cleared. Since the grasslands advanced and retreated, Gruchow realized, its boundaries at any point in time were transitory. The lands I have come to think of as naturally prairie, he realized, were in fact forests. The idea of such a successional pendulum in deep time had intrigued Leopold as well. He recognized that the ecological dynamics of the biome as a whole had prevailed for many millennia. Processes of colonization and succession, showing resilience following flash floods and prolonged drought, severe weather and infernal fire, perhaps even regenerating after glaciation. Among the creatures that inhabit the region's wetlands, including the kettle lakes shaped by glaciers, are several ancient species, such as the snapping turtle, that evolved close to 300 million years ago. Similarly, the dragonfly represented the legacy of primordial ecological order that had found a way to survive for millions of years, for hundreds of millions of years. Gruchow reminds us that the dragonfly was actually among the very first flying creatures on Earth. He grasped that the biological imperative of ecological memory was a key mechanism ensuring the survival of such ancient species. The inherent capacity for regeneration following disruptions, perpetuating aquatic ecosystems over the ages. Seeds dormant for many years remained viable, while grasses were especially resilient. Well-established systems of deep roots remained ready to be revived after decades when favored by ample rain. Can be revived from seeds. Cattails can be revived from seeds that have been long dormant. A marsh could spring forth from a place that had been parched for a quarter of a century. Great antiquity also heightened Gruchow's sense of reverence toward species such as sandhill cranes, among the oldest birds on Earth. Fossils of this archaic bird date back at least 55 million years. To him, a living relic that had managed to survive eons of environmental change. The cry of the cranes also carried connotations of great migrations predicated on ecological memory. Especially given the evolutionary history of such species in deep time, their continuance takes on profound overtones. Gruchow returned every March to the Platte River in Nebraska, a personal pilgrimage to witness once more a migration of a magnitude rivaling the size of any in the world, likening the experience to dream or prayer, prompting him to contemplate the ongoing survival of such seemingly primeval species. We need to be reassured that there is order in logic in things, he declared in Grassroots, that there is predictability and regularity in life, that some things stand fast and hold firm. The cranes never disappoint us. The cranes are always there. The sandhill cranes represented nothing less than a reassurance of order behind change. Gruchow's writings about backcountry experiences in the rugged terrain of the Rocky Mountain West were often framed by recollections of the Midwest. In all these journeys, Lou Martinelli observes, the damaged tallgrass prairie and Gruchow's agricultural roots will not be forgotten. If the early books, such as Journal of a Prairie Year and Grassroots, attempt the reconstruction through memory of our damaged prairie ecology, as Martinelli contends, subsequent essays are set in a variety of unsettled places that still represent ecology that largely survives but is vulnerable. Whether Isle Royal and the Quetico Superior Wilderness described in Boundary Waters, Minnesota's designated scientific and natural reserves portrayed in Worlds Within a World, or remote landscapes of the Rocky Mountain West explored in The Necessity of Empty Places. Such journeys became pilgrimages, giving rise to spiritual overtones and reflections on our perception of nature as sacred. Wildness matters not because it alone is sacred, he reasoned, but because it arouses in us a sense of sanctity that makes visible the sacredness of everything else in life. The way to restore the sense of interconnectedness of all life is to rebuild our memories of nature by experience. He came to believe that our sense of place itself is reconstructed through ecological memory, and that accordingly the study of natural history must encompass our own ever-changing relationship to the rest of life on Earth. Rather than hewing to any romantic notion of an idealized, pristine wilderness, Gruchow grappled with a deeper ethical dilemma of what forms of stewardship are still possible, given the deteriorating state of the natural world, and what purposes they might ultimately serve. The sad irony, he observed, is that what we are now condemned to be is nursemaids to a natural world that is ailing because of our improvements upon it. This was the paradox of wilderness, he declared. It was only when we had already lost it that we could begin to see its value. He lamented that it is still unclear how to reinsert ourselves into nature, which our survival requires, given the biological constraints of life itself. Even preserves and refugia protected from development, he realized, become increasingly vulnerable and volatile, precisely because they have become progressively more fragmented and isolated. In the context of environmental history, such surviving islands in a sea of development, such as remnants of tallgrass prairie surrounded by seemingly interminable tracts of cropland, represent an irreplaceable ecological legacy. He held no illusions about human stewardship, however, realizing that returning nature to any venerated ancient state was already beyond reach. This in turn precipitated a rethinking of the purpose of the preservation of a wide variety of ecosystems where processes of disruption and renewal were perpetually at work. A patch of prairie is not a museum piece, he declared, but a living experiment, a laboratory of constantly evolving ideas, a changing world. Such places, he realized, were each unique repositories offering alternative strategies for biological survival of the biome, which humans might ultimately learn to heed. When we have exhausted our soils and need to learn how to make new ones, he wondered, where will we go for instruction? Into the wilderness, he concluded, where this delicate and complicated work of reconstruction is constantly in practice. Yet he conceded, even full-fledged prairie restorations are probably, at best, only approximations of the real thing. Indeed, if any hope remains at all, our damaged ecologies, the places we live, he maintained, can be made whole, in part, by remembering them when they were whole, then living in such a way as to restore them. As close as he could bring himself to hope, he believed that attempts at conservation were likely to be beneficial in significant and unanticipated ways. The very difficulty of creating even a restored prairie teaches us something valuable about the beauty and complexity of the prairie world. I understand we are going to entertain questions for a bit.
Please, Jordan.
As those of us who, I think, in this room, more and more come into general agreement with the principles that we just did, how does an environmental historian work with things that, I'm sort of reminded of some of the work Gary Snyder has done from, say, the late 60s, early 70s, which sounds now, if you read it, like sort of truism. You have to remember where Snyder was at that time.
Yes.
And what was going on. It was not yet general agreement about this. So how does the environmental historian bring freshness to these generally agreed upon ideas in making people aware of the work of the
That's a great question. First, I concur that Snyder was, so to speak, ahead of his time and prescient, and was also a master of synthesis.
I'm thinking of Four Changes, for example.
Yes. His command of anthropological literature, his appreciation for environmental history before it was being widely discussed. Looking to China, for example, for the desertification and the soil erosion, and suggesting much as George Perkins Marsh did, that lest we go that way ourselves, that the verdant North American continent could be subject to the same degradation over time. I think there is a parallel to be made between Snyder and Gruchow in the fact that both read so widely, thought so deeply, and recognized the gravity before others did. Recognized his declaration in 1988, for example, that beyond merely degrading a host of local habitats, we were putting the very survival of life in peril. That's the kind of argument E.O. Wilson is making today. And Gruchow was making it in 1988. Not that he was the only person or the first person who thought that things had become that advanced. So back to your question is, how do we, as environmental historians, treat the written record of literary naturalists? My trope in the book, Reimagining Environmental History, is to read 10 authors with an eye in each case to how they represent landscape change and how they interpret it over time. I work from Audubon in the beginning of the 19th century up through people still with us and writing today, Louise Erdrich, Elizabeth Dodd, Scott Russell Sanders. And I think you can make the case that there's a single story being told in many voices, and that there is sort of a perennial rediscovery of the principles that the Snyders and the Gruchows and the E.O. Wilsons of the world alert us to. So, Barbara.
My question is very simple.
Oh, good.
Can you give us his dates?
Yeah. Born in 1947, along with DDT, and passed in 2004. Yeah.
I wonder, you mentioned research, but I wonder when you were in particular talking about the Anishinaabe pictographs.
Yes.
I understand that you're interacting with Gruchow's language, and Necessity in 2 Places is one of my favorite books. I love this work. But the idea that there isn't a language or cultural knowledge of what those pictographs are and mean, I would say it's factually incorrect. And so I wonder how, Mark Turcotte or Louisa's sister Hyde or Anton Troyer, those would be
Yes.
some people who would be able, to speak on this more broadly. My knowledge of Anishinaabe is small. I only write and speak just a little. So, but I'm wondering if you're thinking about that as you're interacting with the text.
Let me answer that in a roundabout way. There are themes that are revisited throughout the manuscript of Reimagining Environmental History. One of them is certainly landscape change. One of them is extirpation of wildlife, habitat loss. These are refrains that come up across centuries. Audubon was talking about it in the first half of the 19th century. In 3 of my chapters, there's a focus on rock art and pictographs. There's a chapter on Louise Erdrich, and it's predicated on her Books and Islands in Ojibwe Country. And even she, I think, is cautious most of the time in her interpretations, realizing that she's got a fragmentary, if indeed a culturally insider, access to some of the cultural memory. It isn't the whole thing. And so there is a degree of imagination that's entailed. Elizabeth Dodd also writes, if you're familiar with her, writes a great deal about everything from the Paleolithic caves in France to rock art in the American West. I think what I hear in each of these writers is a profound sense of awe, and part of that awe is driven by mystery, which is where our knowledge leaves off and our wonder begins. Yeah. Other questions?